I could read a very long list of accolades, but I'll just say that Neil really is one of my very, very favorite social scientists, and not just because he's from Cornell. So I'm really looking forward to this talk, Whose Minds Matter. And Neil, thanks so much for being with us.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Katie and Angela for inviting me to speak in the seminar. I've been really enjoying and learning a lot from the talks throughout the semester, and so I'm excited to be able to share some of the work that we've been doing over the past few years that I think is relevant for behavioral science researchers to think about. And I also think these points are important for practitioners and policymakers who use behavioral science to think about as well. To set expectations a bit, I want to note that this is not going to be the kind of talk where I present a fancy new study, though I will share some findings from some of our recent papers. Instead, what I'm going to do in my time today is talk about some methodological and ethical issues that I've been thinking about a lot over the past few years, and their implications for both behavioral science research, as well as the broader implications of that research for our society. So the broad issue that's been on my mind is the issue that has become known as, where did that go? That's become known as the weird people problem in the behavioral sciences. So for listeners who may not be as familiar with this problem, what it means is that if you look across the body of behavioral science research, as Henrik and colleagues did in this paper they published about a decade ago, and you look closely at who has been included in behavioral science research studies, you quickly notice that our sampling frame has been pretty narrow. So most of what we know in social and behavioral sciences, we really only know about people from Western, highly educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. So that's what the weird acronym stands for. That's who we typically recruit for our studies. And it's actually even narrower than that, because within those countries, the typical sampling method, at least for experimental research, is far from representative. So we rely heavily on convenient samples that can distort our understanding of people more broadly. So to give you an example of this from social psychology, which is the field that I was trained in, when researchers looked at papers published in the flagship journal of that field, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, what they found in terms of sample representation is quite mind-boggling. So researchers who examined representation of participants in the studies published in the journal estimate that, and to quote from one of these papers, in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, a randomly selected American undergraduate is more than 4,000 times more likely to be a research participant than is a randomly selected person from outside of the West. So many of the claims made there about people really mean American college students. And look, don't get me wrong, I like American college students. They're nice people. They pay for my salary. But I study the American higher education system. That's one of the domains in which I do a lot of research. And students are not very representative of this country. So many of the universities where much of our data is coming from, the selected research universities in particular, are places where there are often more students from the top 1% of the income distribution than the bottom half. So Raj Shetty and others have done lots of work on this stuff. So my point is they're not very representative of this country, much less the rest of the world. And this is not a new problem. Scholars have been writing about this since before I was born. David Sears wrote this famous paper in the 1980s about this problem of studying college sophomores in the laboratory. And it's not a problem that seems to be going away either. So this year is the 10-year anniversary of that weird paper. So people look back to ask the question, what has changed in that 10 years since that paper was published? And the answer is, unfortunately, not much. So moreover, there's reason to believe that if we don't engage with this issue seriously now, while we're in the midst of other methodological movements in the field, we may end up continuing down this path again for another 30 years or so. The Sears paper was published over 30 years ago. And in my view, that would be a missed opportunity if we did that. Why do I care about this so much? First, if we think about sampling, who we include and exclude from our studies has a number of important implications for our understanding of how the world works. Studying the same groups over and over again can create generalizability problems that can constrain what we know and can even lead to misperceptions about the world and different groups of people within it. And I'll share some examples of this from the environmental realm, which is a domain in which my colleagues and I have been studying these issues a lot lately. So here's one example. My collaborators Adam Pearson, Rainer Marichanes, and John Schultz, and others recently surveyed the American public to ask how much they think each of the following groups are concerned about the environment. The groups they asked about are listed across the x-axis in the figure on your screen. And this is nationally representative data of the American public. So what they found in the survey is that Americans tend to think that white people, young people, and women are really concerned about the environment, but that racial minorities and poor people are less concerned. Now, if you never bothered to study minorities or poor people, and we just talked about how the field has not done as much studies on those groups, then you may very well believe that this is true. After all, if you look at media representations about environmental issues or the makeup of leadership of environmental organizations, what you often see is that white people are the ones that are represented as the faces of the environmental movement. But if you take the time to sample minority groups, you'll find that reality runs counter to these perceptions, right? That the highest levels of environmental concerns in the US are among racial ethnic minorities and lower income Americans. And this makes sense given how patterns of segregation have led to those groups having higher exposure to environmental hazards than their whiter and wealthier peers. So those issues are very salient to these communities, and they're concerned about it. So that's one of the reasons that we've been spending so much time thinking about who we sample and going to great lengths to improve representation in our study samples. Without doing that, we can end up with pretty consequential misunderstandings of different groups of people. So we've been building community partnerships with organizations across the country to recruit participants from groups and from places that are typically excluded and ignored in the research process. And in the before times, we were using our mobile research lab to bring the research of participants' own communities to study their experiences in the very places where they live, play, and work. So doing this has enabled us to get a richer understanding of them as well as their context. But as we diversify our samples, however, we also have to think about and deal with issues of measurement. So earlier I showed you the figure highlighting that minorities and Latinos in particular have the highest levels of environmental concern in the US. Well, we wanted to explore that a bit more. And so one of the things we did was we went to San Antonio, Texas, which is a majority Latino city. And we conducted first a qualitative study with Latino community members to dig deeper and get a richer understanding of those experiences prior to conducting some more survey research. So in this focus group study that we did there, one of the things we asked participants was to identify the most pressing, the most important environmental issues. So in their responses, they named things like air pollution and green space, which are things we might expect. They come up a lot in lots of environmental studies, but they also brought up things like racism and poverty and explain how and why they see those issues as fundamental environmental issues. So these are not issues that typically come up in the environmental studies when you study white college students, for instance, but we ended up learning in this and a series of follow-up studies that they are often top of mind issues for other communities, which suggests that we might have to rethink some of our measurement strategies as we diversify our samples to be able to capture different experiences and different top of mind associations. The other thing that stood out in that research process was how salient differences in life experiences were to our participants. So when we asked participants about the important environmental issues, they told us the issues that were important to them, but they also spontaneously noted differences between their neighborhoods and other neighborhoods in their cities. So in this, between their neighborhoods and other neighborhoods in their city. So one participant, for instance, talked about the issues of racism and poverty as being fundamental environmental issues, but then they also noted, someone from the north side would probably say fracking. So highlighting, and the north side of this city is sort of where the wealthier and whiter people live in that city. So they're noting that these issues that are top of mind for us are different than issues that come up for other groups. So we followed that qualitative work with larger scale survey research and found that it's not just participants in this city. Race, ethnicity, and social class matter more generally for how Americans are conceptualizing environmental issues. Racial minorities and lower SES people thinking more about these human-oriented issues as fundamental environmental issues. And so the takeaway here from these studies is that if you want to have a more holistic understanding of environmental attitudes or other issues, these processes have come up in some of my work in health, as well as work in education, we might actually have to measure things differently as we diversify our samples. This also matters a great deal for the inferences that we make. So if, for instance, we have to measure environmental concern differently among different subgroups of the population, what does that mean for the construct and the generalizability of that construct? These are some of the things we have to deal with. And it's not just an issue in the environmental realm, it's also come up as an issue in other areas of social and behavioral sciences. So another paper that threw me for a loop last year was this paper that came out on the Big Five personality traits, right? In this paper, researchers sampled over 94,000 people from 23 low-income and middle-income countries, found that the common measures that we use to measure personality here in North America often fail to measure personality traits we think of and have low validity in face-to-face surveys in those countries, but they work just fine with internet samples in those same countries. And that makes you stop and think, well, what are we measuring here and what can we actually infer when the measure is valid for part of the population with one sampling approach, but invalid for another part of the population, different sampling strategy. These are some of the things we have to deal with. If we have those kinds of issues, then we have to wrestle with how do we select appropriate statistical models to reach sound scientific judgments. We have to ask whether the models we're using actually map onto the judgments we're trying to make. For more details on this problem, I highly recommend this paper by Danielle Navarro, which does a really phenomenal job of walking through some of these tensions. So these are some of the things we have to spend some time figuring out because, quite frankly, they matter a great deal for people's lives. One of the papers I've been thinking about a lot over the past few years is this paper came out a few years ago by Cameron Brick and colleagues, which highlights what can happen when we get models wrong, and particularly when we omit perspectives that might be critical for how we should conduct our analyses and interpret our findings, especially findings that others might use to make policy and practice decisions. In the environmental realm, for instance, we sometimes forget that our analyses suggesting taking a particular action will reduce risk for one group might have unintended consequences for other groups. And we forget that in part because we're often not studying those other groups. One example of this that was highlighted in the paper was a policy to get rid of diesel and gasoline cars in the UK. The goal of this policy is to reduce health and environmental risks associated with air pollution from these cars. And so the policy seems to be quite good for people in the UK. What we don't often talk about is that drive up demand for lithium-ion batteries containing cobalt, most of which is mined in the Congo, and sometimes by children. So the policies, these kinds of policies will surely save European lives, lives of others in wealthier nations. But estimates by the United Nations and Amnesty International suggest that it'll vastly increase health risks and environmental damage to people in the Congo, right? So if we were to just sample, let's say, European college students and get good measurements about their attitudes about such policies, then it might seem great and the science might suggest it's a good idea to move forward. Whereas if we were to broaden our sampling frame to include the Congolese, we might end up with different conclusions. These kinds of things happen all the time, right? Not only on the international stage, but also domestically. Our policies often have disparate impacts, but as I showed in the beginning of the talk, we're often not studying the people who are most adversely affected by those policies and what they think of them. And that's something that weighs heavily on me and that my collaborators and I have been thinking about as we do this work in a number of different domains. We're doing this research for two main reasons. One, from a purely scientific perspective, we simply don't know how well many of our models hold up with other samples and other populations. And studying that is a valuable scientific contribution in its own right. But second, from a more ethical perspective, if scientific knowledge will continue to lay the foundation for the policies we set in our society, and I think it should, then that knowledge ought to include the broader base of people that will be affected by it. And that second point is something that has come up quite vividly as we've done some of this work. So as we've gone out into communities to conduct our research, many of our participants have thanked us for coming and allowing them to participate in our studies. And I initially found that a bit odd. I started my career studying college students, and the ending interaction with them is usually them asking things like, when will my extra credit be posted on Sona, right? That's sort of the top of mind thing. But with our community participants, it means something different. Participating means something different. The reason the opportunities to participate in studies is so meaningful is because, to use their own words, and I quote, no one usually cares what we think. Something participants have said to us. It is as if they've learned from us, the scientific community, a lesson that was crystallized for me in an op-ed workshop of all places a few years ago, that there are some people who narrate the world and other people who have their world narrated for them. That there are some people who get to be part of the scientific record and others who don't, and they're always in that latter category. Their exclusion from the research process has downstream consequences for what society does with that research. As R.N. Swire noted a few years ago, historical exclusivity often has a way of turning into present and institutionalized tragedy. Whose story gets told matters. Who gets to be part of the scientific record, who gets to be part of our studies matters. So the way I think about all of this now is that when we make our decisions about who to include or exclude from our studies, we are implicitly making decisions about whose minds matter to us. And we have to remember that because those decisions have important implications for the knowledge that we create and the policies and practices that are developed as a result of that knowledge. So in closing, I want to thank the remarkable team of graduate students, collaborators, and community partners who've contributed to the work I presented today and who really shaped my thinking around these issues over the past couple of years. And I also want to thank the Atkinson Center for Sustainability, the Cornell Office of Engaged Research, and Cornell Center for Social Sciences, which have all generously supported and continue to support these research efforts. So I will thank you all and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Neil. I have a feeling this is going to be a very generative conversation. Thanks for setting up this important problem. Do you mind closing out of your slides, and then I'll start diving in. We have 10 questions here already, and I know more will flow in as we start talking about this important topic. Let me start with I think a really helpful one from Don Moore. He's and I'll just read this one. So Don Moore is asking about whether or not, what data we have on what won't generalize. So he says, you seem to be encouraging us to assume that psychological results don't generalize to other groups, but my read of the evidence suggests that it's justifiable to assume fundamental features of psychology generalize well across groups. And he's asking if you could offer guidance on what you see as generalizing best and what you feel is most risky to generalize beyond these weird samples.
Yeah, so the generalizability question, from what I've seen of the meta-scientific studies, it seems to really depend on the domain of psych and really the kinds of studies that are being done. So one issue is replicability, of course, and it seems like more cognitive kinds of tasks. That area seems to have a much better track record than social, for instance, which is where I've been trained. So I think you have to look closely at a lot of these meta-scientific studies that have been coming out and really samples. They've been, there's long been this assumption that the work for, can you hear me? I'm getting...
You've been freezing in and out a little and I can't hear you perfectly. I'm so sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Do you mind repeating what you just said?
Yeah, so there has been this assumption for a long time that things will generalize. And we've had enough studies, at least in the social domain, to suggest that there's a lot of variability across cultures, within cultures, and the like. So we really have to look closely at that. Overall, I think there are some areas like cognitive that have done, from the meta-scientific studies I've seen, cognitive seems to have a better track record than social, but in a lot of areas we just haven't looked, we haven't asked that question, and that's something we need to keep doing.
That's great. This is a related question that's come from a couple of participants. I think it's closely related to what Don was asking, but a little different. And there are a few folks asking about the replication crisis. So Eamon Colvin wants to know if there's any research looking at weird sampling and the replication crisis specifically, and is pointing out that he could imagine instances where certain effects are identified in weird samples, but then fail to replicate in more representative samples. I don't know if you know anything about that, but I thought it was a good question.
Yeah, I mean, the personality paper is one of those examples for me that they looked at the weird versus non-weird samples and find that they have a hard time getting those measures to work in many non-weird places with certain kinds of sampling strategies, right? So that's one example. There's another example of this is a planning intervention I love, so implementation intentions. And one of the things that came out a couple of years ago was this paper showing that it works really well in individualistic societies and has little effect in collectivistic societies. And that was another moment for me of well, there's nothing here in the theory that suggests that individualism versus collectivism shouldn't matter. But when you look in these large scale studies that try to replicate the effect, yeah, it works really well in one with people with one kind of cultural orientation, but not so much with others. So I think more and more of these studies are coming out. Most of them in sort of the past 5 years, these big, large scale studies looking for that. But I think we need more of that research to continue refining our understanding of which of these things are going to work across the board and which are pretty culturally specific.
Super interesting. Okay, I'm going to read a really helpful question from Dolly Chug here, where she's asked a very thoughtful question. If I try to paraphrase, it won't go as well. So here are her words. She asks, how do we avoid sloppy thinking, which leads people to assume the differences between samples are due to essential differences between people, as opposed to differences in the situations people face? So she says, for example, gender differences are sometimes attributable to fundamental differences between genders, as opposed to differences in how men and women and other genders are socialized. Same thing seems to be happening when racial disparities in the COVID crisis are discussed.
Yeah, I love that question. Thanks, Dolly. This is why I think, well, there are a few answers to this. One answer methodologically is to gather what data you can to be able to tease those things out. So in another conversation early in the semester I had with Angela and Katie with their class, I mentioned that one of the things they do now a lot is I measure zip code, right, as one of my standard demographics. And one of the things that collecting zip code allows me to do is actually link to other data sets that the government and the others organized by zip code that can tell you something about the context, right? And so you can look at how much of the variance is explained by sort of individual difference, how much of the variance is explained by these broader contextual features. So if you measure it, then you're able to examine that. So that's one piece. The other piece is, this is, I didn't talk as much about diversity on the researcher side in this talk because I was trying to keep it short, but this is another place where I think having more diverse teams to help you think through what's going on helps you get a better understanding of what's going on. And there have been some recent papers on that. Stephen Roberts' group had a paper on inequality and psychology and how who the researchers are affects things. And Sidney Dupree and Michael Krauss have another paper in that realm as well. So you need sort of both things. You need a diverse set of people asking the questions and thinking carefully about it. But you also need the measures to be able to figure out how much of it is these contextual differences versus individual differences.
Super interesting. Okay, so we have a bunch of questions from different audience members, including Sarah Newcomb, an anonymous attendee as well, pointing out that one of the challenges of getting diverse samples is that it can be more expensive. So they're also worrying about how, what are the implications of that for diverse researchers, for folks who may not always have huge research budgets, sort of how do we balance? And Erica Kyrgios, who's a PhD student here at Wharton, asked a question that might trigger some thinking around an answer. She's saying, given the limited resources, how do you think we should actually decide what questions to prioritize answering outside of weird samples? So should we invest first in seeing whether fundamentals replicate, turn our attention to other policy questions? So I guess I'd love for you to answer Erica's question and also sort of this broader thought on what do we do with the challenge of expense and in getting better sampling?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on that. So on the expense piece, I think we need to think about this broadly as scientific institutions, and I want to pull funders into this conversation as well, because this is something that's always comes up. Well, diverse samples are expensive, and therefore I'm not going to do it. You know what's more expensive? Neuroscience, right? Like building these giant scanning centers and running them, it's very expensive. We think it's important, and so we invest in it. We could, running the mobile lab that we have here, it is an expensive endeavor, but it's a fraction of the cost of running, a tiny fraction of the cost of running a scanning center. So we don't apply that expensive argument equally to different kinds of research. And so that's something we should question. Think about. So that's one piece, but they're all on a more practical level, for the graduate students and others who are having to deal with this right now, before dealing with these funding decisions. There are lower cost ways of doing this. You can go out and partner with community organizations and the like, bringing pen and paper, surveys, and surveying people that way. That's one way of dealing with this. So there are lower cost options available. The other question, can you remind me of the second question?
Yeah, the other part of the question was sort of where to start. So say we're going to go out and spend limited resources. And I agree with you, by the way, that we should just throw more resources at the problem. But anyway, let's say we haven't solved that yet, but say we have limited resources for this. Where do you think there's sort of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of what questions we should try to replicate outside of weird samples?
Yeah. I think it really depends on what are the findings that you think are going to, or what are the areas of inquiry that are going to move us forward the most, both from theory development as well as the practical implications, right? So we're talking about expense in one sense. There are always these trade-offs. So what do we need to know that we don't yet know, right? So there's some findings that you might not think it's worth it to spend as much money because just you don't think it's going to add that much knowledge either theoretically or like there's no practical use for it. So don't bother. Whereas there are other areas that you can think about those practical. I mean, I think of it often through the practical lens, right? And you can see that from the work that I do because I'm working in education, I'm working in health, I'm working in the environment. So I'm like, well, what do we need to know to do something? That's the question that's in my mind. And so that guides my prioritization of questions a lot. But it's something that I think you really have to ask yourself those sort of really underlying value questions about what do I need to know to advance the research agenda, the practical.
I just had you freeze again, Neil. I'm sorry about that.
Sorry, I don't know
I don't think there's
why I
anything
say
you
that.
can
Am
do
I back
about
now?
it. This is just the world we live in these days. So I just want you to know it's
Yeah,
anyway. I think we got the key gist, and I'll
yeah.
sort of repeat to make sure I got it. But it felt like what you're saying at its heart is two things. One, let's actually spend more on this. It's really important. And two, when we're choosing where to begin, let's think about probably applied problems where the science is going to matter and where like we have policy influence with the science, so that we aren't making important policy decisions using the wrong sampling tools or the wrong inferences. Does that feel right?
Yeah, that's the way that I think about it. I always have the practical implications in the back of my mind. I know that not everyone orients their research that way. So if you don't, then you can think about what are the areas where the knowledge is just limited in your field, and you can make an advancement that way.
Great. Okay. Well, here's a question from Emily Falk, who's a colleague of mine here at Penn and
Oh,
on Team BCFG, who I know you know well. She said,
yeah.
thanks for the talk, Neil, which I'll add that. Thank you for the thought-provoking talk. And she notes that you've written about levels of policy readiness for scientific evidence. She wanted to know if you could talk about how that framework considers unmeasured costs, for instance, your UK versus your Congo samples, and how researchers should think about when we're ready to translate our findings.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is incredibly important, right? So the unmeasured cost, just because we don't measure the cost, it doesn't mean it's not there, right? And so this is part of why it's so important. One of the things we emphasize in that evidence readiness paper is having stakeholders at the table to help us think through what are the various benefits and what are the various costs that we might not think about immediately, right? So, that in that UK Congo example, in some ways, that's really having someone who can think through the supply chain, right? Of, oh, well, if you want to buy more electric cars, where's all of that going to come from? And then that would flag, oh, actually, we need to really think carefully about what. And so as a researcher, you're not always going to know what those costs are up front. And that's why I think it's so important to have community partners from the very beginning to help you think through some of those things and how you factor them into the design of the study, as well as down the road implementation plans.
Really helpful. Okay, here's a really practical question as well that I think many people are probably wondering about from Eamon Colvin again. Eamon has asked, or noted that researchers are turning to online recruitment platforms like MTurk and Prolific Academic at an increasing volume. And he wants to know if you see these platforms as opportunities for more representativeness and inclusivity, or if they actually just create a different set of problems.
Yeah, so this is something that has come up a lot. So one big change over the past 10 years is the increase in MTurk. There's actually a nice paper on the MTurkification of social and personal psychology that came out last year. And those samples are more diverse than college students, but they are limited in a different way that, again, you have to think about the trade-offs, right? So it's still online. Basically, what that limits your ability to study is anything that can be done in a 20-minute survey on a computer. And there's a lot of things you can learn from that, but there are lots of other things you can't learn from that. If you're interested in vivo interactions, you can't learn that in MTurk. You have to go and observe people. So we've done some work like going into health clinics and watching how people behave there. Like, I can't do that on MTurk. So there's some things that you can learn in those online contexts, but you really have to remember what can you apply that knowledge to and what can't you? The danger I see, the biggest danger I see with that mode is people measuring things online and then making really grand claims about how this now tells us about behavior in the world. When there's a lot of work on that intention behavior gap. You can ask people about their intentions. You can ask people about their attitudes, but you have to remember that there is a big gap there often between what they say in those surveys and what they will do in life. So if your goal is behavior, eventually you have to look at that. And so those are the trade-offs I think are important to keep in mind.
Okay, that's really helpful. Here's an interesting question from Laura Van Berkel that I think is important on ethics. She said, first, thanks for your talk, and then asks, sometimes research done using non-weird samples can be exploitative. So, or exploitative. I'm pronouncing that wrong. It can exploit populations.
Yep.
So it's sort of like doing research on them is what she says. And without input partners in the community, it can be particularly fraught. So she wanted to know what your recommendations were for best practices uh, to try to avoid possibly falling into that category of exploiting these non-weird populations.
Yeah, and again, I think, so it's a great and important question because there's certainly many stories of going wrong. And that can facilitate, that can lead to more distrust, which creates this negative spiral. This is again where I think the community-based research approach is important to remember, where it's not just like, I, the researcher, have this grand idea, go to the community and say, like, have your people come participate in my study. I will extract this information and never tell you about it again. You have to think about it as more of a partnership, right? And you want to get input early if possible, to make sure that there would be mutual benefit, right? So there are things that you want to learn as a scientist. There are things that community will want to learn, or other reasons they might want to partner with you, and you have to think through. That. So, IRBs always ask us to think about risks and benefits, and I think many times we don't take that seriously. We check the box. There's no risk there, and there's no benefit in this research. I'm just doing science, but there are real risks and benefits that we have to think about, and talk to members of these communities to try and maximize those benefits and minimize those risks.
All right, I'm going to turn for our last few minutes to some questions about very specific problems. So one is from David Marquette, who's asking, what insights are there for election polling, which may be suffering from the same phenomenon, albeit to a lesser degree?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another domain that I think we've got work to do, right? That one of the things, both this past election as well as 2016, I think a lot of social scientists, just seeing the discourse and then how many papers came out afterwards, were just surprised at the election of Donald Trump. And the fact that it's that surprising tells us something about who we haven't been studying. And so that's something I think we have to think about, right? Like, I've talked about racial and economic differences in sampling and why we need to do better there. But I also think that political ideology is another dimension that we should think about this more as well. So yeah, others have written more about this, and I know there are other BCFG scientists who are much more expert on that domain. But I think these arguments apply to this domain as well.
Really, really helpful. Okay, I am now going to selfishly ask a question as sort of our last one, then Angela will come back and we'll thank you. So the last thing I would love to hear you talk about, and I'm going to ask you to veer slightly away from the focus of this talk, but only very slightly. I think a lot of us right now are very focused on the COVID crisis and the coming vaccine and the challenges that we can all foresee around encouraging particularly high-risk groups, particularly minority populations that tend to be nervous about this vaccine based on early data to adopt it. And I'm thinking a lot about the weird samples we've used in our past research on encouraging follow through on things like vaccination, often like university populations. I'm wondering if you think there are any key insights that those of us who are going to be in the behavioral science community offering advice on this topic should keep in mind. Any things that you think might be different, communication strategies we should use that might not be the first that would leap out of the literature based on your work with non-weird samples?
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about a lot, and wrote one piece on why it's so hard to intervene in COVID. Um, we have to remember and acknowledge the distrust between some minority communities and the medical system that is there for good reason, right? So when, I've seen some narratives out there about hesitancy with the COVID vaccine being sort of similar to anti-vax, and that's not what that is, right? Like when you think about the history of medicine and treatment in certain groups, there's good reason to be skeptical. And so we have to acknowledge that history and then try to rebuild trust, right? So we have to talk a lot about who was in these studies. Like, so who, like, I mean, I'm waiting for more of this data to come out from these COVID vaccine trials to look at representation in the trials, right? This is important. And you have to use that data then as you develop the messages, to be able to assure people that, yes, this is safe, and we know that it's safe for people like you. And like, here are all the ways that we know that. So being transparent about the process of the vaccine development and the like, I think will be important to build trust, and the trust that's necessary for people to adopt it.
That's great. I really like that distinction you made about sort of anti-vaxxers and those who have legitimate reason to mistrust the system, that we need to recognize that legitimacy. Thank you so much for doing this today. This has been really interesting and important conversation. And I appreciate you taking the time to spur it with us. I know Angela's back. Ooh.
I'm giving you a round of applause on behalf of everyone, Neil. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
We're so grateful. I guess we have a couple of final announcements, right? Angela, do you want to be our final announcer?
Sure. Next week, we have David Yeager from UT Austin. The title of his talk is Beliefs Count Twice: How to Harness the Human Stress Response to Promote Well-Being and Skill Development. And then if you want to reiterate the special talk that's happening on December 4th.
Yes. Okay. For anyone who didn't join in time to see at the beginning or hear our turkey joke, one, you should go watch it on our website when it's posted, because Angela's delivery is amazing. And second, Richard Thaler is going to be joining Kevin Volt for a special conversation on December 4th from 4:15 to 5 p.m. And you can register. I'm going to actually put it in the chat again, because I'm not sure you can see it if you signed in after I put it before. So sorry to everyone who's seeing it twice. But I'll be introducing the event. We're really excited to be promoting it in partnership with our friends at the Center for Health Incentives and Behavioral Economics. They're going to be talking about health and behavioral science, so very relevant to some of the things we just discussed. And I think it's going to be great. So we hope to see you there, as well as at next Monday's regularly scheduled seminar. All right. And everybody have a good, safe, socially distanced Thanksgiving.
And thank you, Neil. That was fantastic.
It really was. Thank you so much for being our speaker. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.